Good evening, and welcome to this webinar on priests and synodality in Australasia with Father Joe Grayland, Father Brendan Reid, and Sister Carmel Pilcher. My name is Patricia Gemmell. I'm a member of both the Grail and Women and the Australian Church, and a founding member of Australian Women Preach, and I will be your moderator this evening. I am speaking to you from the lands of the Camaragal on Sydney's North Shore. We acknowledge the Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and Maori people, the traditional custodians of the lands on which we live. We celebrate their continuing culture and their care for these places over many generations. We acknowledge our part in their dispossession. We recognise with shame the suffering that endures to the present generation, and we commit ourselves to work with them for reconciliation, recognition, and justice. Our prayer tonight is the Ad Sumus prayer, used to open each session of the recent Synod and of the Second Vatican Council, and has been used by the Catholic Church for hundreds of years. Please pray with me. We stand before you, Holy Spirit, as we gather together in your name. With you alone to guide us, make yourself at home in our hearts. Teach us the way we must go and how we are to pursue it. We are weak and sinful. Do not let us promote disorder. Do not let ignorance lead us down the wrong path, nor partiality influence our actions. Let us find in you our unity, so that we may journey together to eternal life and not stray from the way of truth and what is right. All this we ask of you, who are at work in every place and time, in the communion of the Father and the Son, forever and ever. Amen. Our webinar tonight will last approximately an hour and a half. Our two speakers, Father Joe Grayland and Father Brendan Reid, will each speak for about 25 minutes. After this, we will have a Q&A session, followed by a response from Sister Carmel Pilcher. Please use the Q&A function for your questions or comments, and please keep them as brief as possible. The Synod on Synodality finished in October last year, and we are now in the implementation phase. In Australia and New Zealand, it would seem that few parishes have made it a priority, and the concept is still neither understood nor accepted at parish level to any significant extent. For synodality to become a new way of being in the Church, we need the leadership and the accompaniment of our priests. That is how a hierarchical church operates. And yet we know that priests globally have been largely disengaged from the synodal process. Why is this so? It is my view that in a co-responsible church, it is the responsibility of us all to address this issue. In The Afternoon of Christianity, The Courage to Change, Tomas Halik asserts the conviction that personal spiritual accompaniment will be the crucial pastoral role in the church of the future, and the one most needed. At the heart of synodality, the greatest challenge is one of conversion, of change of heart. Paragraph 43 of the final document tells us that synodality is primarily a spiritual disposition. No one can progress along the path of authentic spirituality alone. We need support, including formation and spiritual accompaniment, both as individuals and as a community. What we are seeing in these statements is really a vision for much deeper relationship. What kind of a challenge is that for priests who are seeking to build a more synodal church? In what ways are they being asked to change? And what does that mean for the laity? In an area as large as Australia and New Zealand combined, there is, of course, a great diversity of priests, parishes and dioceses, and no one-size-fits-all solution. Each one of us needs to discern the challenges of our own particular context and the needs of our own particular faith communities. Our first speaker to enlighten us on the challenges before us will be Father Joe Grayland, a priest of the Palmerston North Diocese, New Zealand, where he has worked in several parishes. He currently lectures at the University of Würzburg, Germany, specialising in liturgy and sacramental theology. He has written and spoken publicly about many issues of interest to our audience tonight, and I can tell you that he was one of my favourite authors whenever an article of his would appear in La Croix magazine. In the New Zealand context, his reflection on the changing face of Catholic identity is significant for understanding the future of the Church in that country. Our second speaker will be Father Brendan Reid, a priest in the Archdiocese of Melbourne for over 30 years, where he lectures at Catholic Theological College. He is currently the parish priest of the Brunswick and Moreland Catholic Mission, an amalgamation of 4 parishes. Brendan is the author of Engaging with the Hopes of Parishes, a study of the Catholic identity of parishes in contemporary society, and he is currently the chair of the Archbishop's Council of Priests. After the Q&A session, Sister Carmel Pilcher will make a response to our speakers. Carmel is a sister of St. Joseph and a liturgy and culture consultant and educator based in Sydney. She has worked extensively in many dioceses across Australia. In recent years, she taught liturgy and sacraments at the Pacific Regional Seminary in Suva, Fiji. And now it is my pleasure to invite Father Joe Grayland to speak to us.
Patricia, thank you very much, and thank you for your very warm welcome. It's a pleasure for me to be here on this webinar with ACCCR and Garratt Publishing. Also like to greet Brendan and Carmel, who will be responding, and everybody else on the webinar. So to begin with, I have a slide that will come up for you to see. And priests and synodality in Australasia, but I'm speaking to you from Würzburg, and what you can see there is the River Main, and there is an old bridge here, ancient bridge, which is a great gathering area for people to drink a glass of Silvana, and the old Main bridge is now really just an outdoor pub. So as we move on to our next slide, I want to offer my comments around 4 lenses or 4 perspectives. I think they are important for the discussion when we talk around priesthood and ministry and diocese, etc. I don't see them as absolutes, I see them as ways to view it. So in lens 1, I would say to you that priests are not a typical or homogeneous group. They're not like a molecular structure. They've come from different places, they have different values. Most of them have been through the Tridentine seminary system, which was a good thing in its day, but it's broken. And also there's significant migration and cultural change. There's also within the church a very important debate issue going on around liturgy, and people forget that liturgy is the primary theology out of which all other theologies flow as secondary theologies. And what we do in worship actually tells everybody what we believe, and so how we gather and when we gather is critical. And therefore, if we gather as a group, or as we gather as a group of people looking at the clergy doing their thing, we have fundamentally different worldviews. And these backgrounds and training and spirituality come into our parochial world through the fact that clergy are differently trained. So there are religious priests, there are order priests, there are monks, there are what used to be called secular or world priests, people like me, who in many places like New Zealand, we've really been the secular priesthood has been captured by the 19th century religious congregations, And so that's the way that we're remunerated and also treated. So there's real issues there. And I think it's very important that when I look at different parishes and how they're run, often I see if there's a religious group or a monastic group running a parish, the parish can very easily become just an extension of their novitiate or an extension of their monastic worldview. And that's one of the issues with synodality coming from a Jesuit pope, is that it brings in a whole lot of things that the Jesuits easily understand because they've been through the training process, which people like me do not as easily understand. And then I think we get to the fact that we have a lot of frustrated clergy. There's a very good article come out yesterday in a publication here called Christen der Gegenwart, and a priest of 30 years is reflecting over several points. And in the end, it's like he entered and became a priest in order to do one thing, and now he finds himself doing a whole lot of other things which are not related to his priesthood. When we look at the next slide, and it has that younger clergy are out of step with Catholic laity, and this comes from Tomas Rees, and it was recently in Flashes of Insight, which was uploaded then from its original source. And in it, when we look at the next slide, there is a very interesting statement here that according to this national study, there's an even sharper divide, not just in the US church internationally, but key for a lot of churches, between the progressive and the conservative. And so among the clergy ordained before 1975, more than 70% describe themselves as theologically progressive, while those ordained 2010 or later, only 8% would do so. And you can see this in the split within the United States Church, which becomes very dangerous for everybody in the English-speaking world, because the United States Church is still quite wealthy, still very wealthy, very influential. But what we see coming out of this are online influences, clergy and others in the Catholic world, down to the point where I was looking at one commentator saying, if you're not Catholic, you are damned. Or J.D. Vance turning and commenting on his wife's belief and saying it would be far better if she was a Catholic. Although when I look at some of J.D. Vance's understandings of Catholicism, I then begin to think, what do the two Dominicans who instructed him actually say? And then we come on to another point, which is the next slide, of conflicting worldviews. And I think this is a very important thing. Three very handsome young men, apparently they're coming to Australia to be seminarians. New Zealand's in the same boat. Most of our seminarians have dried up over the years, and the very few that are New Zealand born and raised, which is also a cultural mix of many different people, are in the minority. And so we are importing young men from countries like the Philippines and Vietnam. And I think there are great moral questions that need to be raised, as well as liturgical and theological ones about what that means. But coming back to the conflicting worldviews, I think what's important is to understand, and I've seen this in parishes, and I've seen it even in my own home parish where I was ordained and raised, that however you frame it, a Caucasian, English-speaking, Eurocentric, Irish, English, Scots church, whatever you want to say, which in terms of New Zealand arrived, interesting enough, founded by the French, but then overtaken by the Irish in the early 19th century. And so what happens is that a whole concept of church is founded, and that concept of church is what I would call the compound. So you buy a piece of land. On the first corner, you build the church. The second corner, you build the presbytery. The third corner, you build the school. And the fourth corner, you build the convent. And everybody's in the compound. And the
Mm.
compound is there, and the compound is saying to the world, we are here.
Mm.
In the process in New Zealand, as I presume in many other countries, Māori and many other people get dislocated, and their worldview, their understanding of the cosmos, their understanding of the pantheon of gods, and their understanding of the nature and history of the world through their own mythologies, all get sidelined or pushed down because they aren't representative of the Christian world. And the Christian world that comes to this place, which I am influenced by, and I suspect many on this webinar are, is by the Enlightenment worldview, the European Enlightenment. And it's central to the concept of Vatican II. And I think it's an unargued centrality that there is within the liturgical movements, the ecumenical movements, and the scriptural movements in the 19th and 20th centuries, a desire to get back to the sources. Ressourcement is really important. And so as we go back to the sources, the frame of mind that takes us there is a critical one of religious oversimplification, a critical analysis of language, a critical analysis of worship, a critical analysis of how people worship and what they say. So our European Enlightenment world questions simplistic religious assumptions, questions then also symbolism, calls us to back to the truth. What is the truth? Where are the sources? And in that process, there seemed to be a desire, and there was a desire, to rid ourselves of the crustaceans, if you like, that were on the bottom of the bark of Peter that really didn't fit this 19th century, 18th century, 17th century, early 20th century concept of the European Enlightenment, out of which come a whole lot of other philosophical processes. So what happens for that is it presents a safe or made safe God, a he, she, or it, who knows, in the end, it doesn't matter. And so there's a very important argument there. But this God has a place in society, but this God is not malevolent. This God is part of the social fabric, and therefore everything becomes part of it. And so somehow in this world, the God that we worship is a God who reflects our own values. Then what I've seen in coming in New Zealand, into New Zealand, especially from India, from Southeast Asia, from the Pacific, is what I would describe as a sacral worldview, which presumes the place of the sacred and the deity in the normal flow of life. So we see this in many different places. You know, it doesn't matter whether you're going to a temple or to a mosque or to a church. The key thing is that you are going to one of those things. And so social interaction, social intercourse, social events are also religious events. For instance, in New Zealand, it's become normative that if a building is opened in the early dawn hours, a karakia and a blessing is given to the building. It's normal for a meeting to begin with a karakia, a prayer. But when you say it in Māori, it's accepted. But when you say the same thing in English at a public meeting, you will be criticized for bringing religion into it. So therefore, there's huge questions there in terms of the cultural appropriation of people's worship again to do something else. But in these sacral cultures, there's a certainty to the place of the divinity. There's an integration of the symbolism. There's a deferential response to God, and I think that's extended then to clergy. But I think hidden in there too is a malevolent God who's also a risk, a God that must be appeased. And at the basis of that, we have quite different cosmologies, different pantheons of God. And these are part of the things that we don't always recognize when we're looking at the significant changes that are taking place in our parishes and our dioceses. Out of that, we get international clergy. And so they have a sense of dislocation. So they come with all of this. So they look at a place like New Zealand, if they're coming from Vietnam or from the Philippines or from India, from Kerala, and they say there's no faith here because the faith is expressed differently. Because the faith that people will find in people like me in New Zealand is based on a European Enlightenment understanding of how you believe. But clergy with whom I have worked coming from India, from Vietnam, and from the Philippines will come and look at that and say, it's not faith. You don't believe. And therefore, we have this other problem going on, I'll get into a moment, is as this diocesan structure breaks down, these young men, priests and also seminarians, are brought in by bishops who do not understand the enormous harm that they are causing to the local churches. And so what they are bringing in is a new movement of colonization. So a priest from India said to me one day, "You don't know what colonization is. We were colonized by the British." And I said, "Actually, I do know what colonization is like. Every time you step into the sanctuary to celebrate Mass, I feel colonized because you use a language I do not know, you use metaphor that I do not know, you have presumptions of faith that are not mine." And so in that moment, it was an eye-opener for me. I suddenly, finally understood what it must have been like for Māori when the Europeans first arrived. So if I go on then to slide 7, and what I'd like to talk about here, and Brendan will talk about it much more, so this is his area, but people say that parishes are collapsing, and I say no. Parishes are not collapsing. They are simply the delivery mechanism. The dioceses are collapsing. And we have lots of bishops who do not understand the collapse of their own diocese. And I would say it goes all the way through to the top. So the diocesan structure is one that manages the parishes. But the trouble is that it often overreaches in that management and makes it impossible for the parish to respond. And so as these things collapse, people see it at Sunday Mass, there's no priest, and they have a liturgy of the word, and then there's a question, have they fulfilled their obligation? Is it a real liturgy, or should they go off to Mass somewhere else? You have a lay presider who is not allowed to sit in the presider's chair, but I would argue they should. And then you have communion taken from the tabernacle, from a Mass sometime during the week or weeks previous. So you have yesterday's bread. And so in that whole construct, you do the one thing that breaks the church apart. You fail to provide the Eucharist for the local community because you have other priorities that are more important than celebrating the great Passover meal or the Eucharist, however you wish to state it. This great thing that Jesus gave us. And so in that moment, what we do is we take from our people, we take everything from them, from the clergy and the laity, from all the baptized. We take away something and we give them an ersatz form. And then we say to them, make sense of this. And so when they do start making sense of it, we step in and say, no, you can't do that because it's not liturgically correct, or it's against the canon law or whatever. But in fact, what we've done is we have catechized people into a non-sacramental, non-Eucharistic church. And then we step back, or the bishops step back because they're not doing their job, and they say, oh, how do we deal with this? Well, they do have to deal with it theologically. But unfortunately, most times, because of diocesan collapse, everything is dealt with managerially. So we import the seminarians, because we don't have local clergy, or we import clergy, and then don't deal with the issues that are part of that for everyone. And then we look at the priest who has got one parish and we give him 2 or 3 more. I wrote an article in La Croix, and it was to the priest who has everything, give him another parish. I was contacted by so many clergy throughout Australasia and Europe and for a copy of it, because it must have just touched a nerve. That we know that there is a structural issue and a structural failure, and that failure impacts on everyone. So what we need, unfortunately, is a reform, but it can't be done through secondary things like canon law or management structures. It has to be done theologically. But the big danger that we run is that we live in a non-theological church where people say, oh, it's too difficult, the theology, make it simpler. Or we have the answer to everything is a pastoral need, and therefore we can send every other thing off to the edge. And so as we come then to this last slide, which is, sorry, it's not the last one, lens 3. There's a functional priesthood and ministry, I think, which drives the theology. So if we've got a group of 20 people somewhere, then we get the priest to travel 50 Ks, and we do that because we want to keep the church open and because it's been there for 200 years and blah, 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 blah. You go all the way through all of these things, and in the end, you begin to ask yourself, what is the rationale for priesthood and ministry at all? And this is where I think it actually hits laity very, very hard, in the sense that we prepare the baptized to be leaders of worship and leaders of parishes. And then what we do is we don't actually give them the support and the structure behind it to make it actually work. And in some places, we don't give them enough training. So that we have people who are preaching, but really don't have the training behind them to do that. And therefore, what we always do is that we keep running away from things like the liturgy of the word and the word of God being proclaimed as integral to the life of a community of the believers. So as we go through, I think in this functional priesthood, one of the things that we saw through the COVID period and came out very strongly was all of these clergy having their own little sideshow or slideshow masses on YouTube or wherever. And most of them were just simply appalling. But more importantly, in behind all of that, and in behind some of the things that were put forward, even behind the direction from the Vatican in terms of how we were to celebrate the Easter Triduum, took us back to what is I would describe as a pre-Vatican II understanding of the distinction between clergy and laity. So, for instance, for the Triduum, the Vatican said very clearly, the priest can celebrate it on his own. He doesn't need to have the laity there. If there's some laity there to sing or to do something, that's good, but not necessary. And then you look at all of these online masses and you see a priest sitting at his own table, basically having lunch by himself, and everybody else is looking on. And then a slide goes up, we'll have a spiritual communion, which is just complete bullshit. And so you get to these points and you begin to wonder, what is going on? Where are we going in all of this thing? And then we have clergy in the United States, Dominicans again, suggesting that there could be a service whereby people can receive communion before, during, or after the Mass that has been celebrated in the church and online. And that concept of communion not linked to the Eucharistic prayer that is celebrated by the community who are there in all of their levels and hierarchy and all of their understandings is a pre-Vatican II idea. It comes straight out of the 1962 Missal, because the function of celebrating Mass and the function of receiving communion are not linked, because there is no functional link between the laity and the clergy. And the Second Vatican Council changed that, but we went back to it. So then we come to the last lens, which is trust in the future and the synodal process. Formation and accompaniment are key ideas coming out of the synodal process. But formation and accompaniment of clergy is not equal, so it's not homogeneous. Some priests are formed very well and others less so, depending where they come from, depending in which world and language and culture they're operating and born and grown up in and trained in. So the other thing which I think is very important to understand is that the ongoing formation and accompaniment of clergy is not the same as what you would expect in businesses or in hospitals or in schools. So when I go to my doctor, I know that he or she is doing ongoing training, and that is demanded by the law. I go to an architect in New Zealand, I know that they're doing ongoing training. I know that it's the same for an accountant. I know that it's even the same for a plumber, because I worked in those areas doing education for these sort of groups. I know that it happens, but when I look at the clergy, it's less so, and it's not formalized and it's not structured often, and it's also not expected. So therefore, one has to understand that not all the clergy are getting the formation that they need. And so I think this becomes important. I think the buy-in to the future synodal process also has a whole level of trust between clergy, between themselves and between priests and bishops, and also a level of trust between the clergy and the laity. Because even when we set out a webinar like this, there is unfortunately in it the presumption that laity and clergy are different. They are in terms of form and function, etc. We know all of that. However, the responsibility for a synodal church rests on the entire baptized community. The problem is, of course, that the baptized do not always have agency in their own community. But then neither do the priests always have agency within their own presbyterate. And then you get to the level where bishops don't often have agency in their own diocese. And so we have this world which is so complex, where you can see that this tug of war takes place. And so I would like to conclude. These are ideas. I hope it hasn't come across as a bash up on the priests. I think there is real need for substantial reform that needs to be taking place at the episcopal level. That's what those guys are ordained to do. But I think there is a real encumbrance at the episcopal level to face questions like, what is the church here for? And how does the church do its own stuff? Especially when you take out all of the social action and you come back to the foundation of what is the church and how is it for. I think the second thing with bishops is that they need to think much more carefully about the impact of cultural changes within their parishes and dioceses, and that would be one area that I would suggest for the future, that laity and clergy, bishops can get together on an equal footing and begin to understand what's happening in their own world so that they can address those changes as a single group. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Joe. You've certainly given us a lot to think about. I'd now like to invite Father Brendan Reid to address us.
Thanks, Patricia, and thanks, Joe, and welcome to everyone who's joined us tonight. I'm just going to share my screen and present some slides that I'll talk to. So thanks for the opportunity to reflect with you on priests and synodality in Australia. I thought I'd just begin a little bit about myself. Briefly, I have been a priest for 35 years, and 23 of those years I've worked in parishes. 3 years I was in full-time study, and 9 years I was full-time working in Catholic education. These days I'm doing a bit of consultancy, and mainly I'm a parish priest. I was ordained in 1990. I've been involved in parish ministry, as I said, for over 30 years, but full-time 23 years. I've been involved over those years in parish councils, in parish finance committees, in education boards, in projects of looking to the future in a consultative way. Many years ago, in the development of deaneries in the Archdiocese of Melbourne, and more recently in amalgamation of parishes and resetting directions. I'd like to think that these are synodal processes, and that perhaps some of us have, even without naming, been doing a little bit of synodal work over the years. We're called today, priests and all the baptised, to a synodal church in the midst of pastoring multiple parishes, responding to the pastoral demands of the day. We just invited in our parishes 108 families to come to a memorial service because each one of those had experienced a bereavement in the last 12 months. The year before, 130. Funerals, baptisms, school chaplaincy, hospital chaplaincies, aged care, young people engagement, planning for mission, administrative, HR, property, finance, infrastructure, all make up the life of the very diverse life of parishes, priests, and the baptised. The context in which all this is happening has changed enormously, and that makes a big challenge for a call to synodality. The Australian Church, like much of the Western world, continues in the process of pluralisation. We know that from the last census data in Australia, that now less than 50% of Australians identify with one or another denomination of Christianity. Disaffiliation continues, people who are leaving churches. Mass attendance is below 10% and in some cases below 5%. The process of pluralisation and secularisation is leading to what I've called in my work before, colourful and relativistic institutions, even within our church. Big challenges ahead. Looking towards the future, what does this mean? In particular, I want to get to focusing on the question of synodality. I am a pastoral and empirical theologian, so I like to look at data and look at the world around me and the actual phenomenology. My questions have been for some time, what's the impact on Catholic parishes? And tonight's focus is on priests, of the context of this growing cultural pluralism and the societal shifts that have taken place in relation to religious affiliation and practice over the last 20 years. And it's not just parishes and priests, its impact on Catholic institutions, Catholic schools and so forth. That's not our topic tonight. How are Catholic parishes and priests responding to this context? What is their desired future? How can we evaluate their self-understanding from a theological point of view? And how can we support priests and parishes so that parish life and structures and activities will remain both culturally plausible and theologically valid? They're the questions that I've been working with for quite some time. Parishes in particular. I'd like now to share with you some models of parishes that I've worked on, created, studied, run surveys on, and particular today to throw the light, to throw a synodality in the mix with those parish models. What are parishes going to look like today and tomorrow? What are the diverse expectations and hopes that people have of their parishes? Well, some of you may have seen my work on models of parishes. If you have, bear with me while I brief you again, but stay tuned because I'm going to add further to and introduce some aspects that I haven't spoken about before to do with synodality. So in trying to understand how parishes and parishioners and priests are dealing with the changed context, I created a model of parishes that's built around two axes. If you can see that on your screen, the vertical one runs from public to private, and it represents that tension line that in modernity, religion has sort of been relegated to the private realm. It's not meant to be public like it was in the days of Christendom. But is that true? And are people happy to stay in the private realm, or do they want to be in the public? So there's one tension line. The other one, the horizontal line runs from one side to the other, proclamation and dialogue. Of course, in the church, we need both. On the left-hand side, though, is proclamation alone, and uncomplicated, uncritical proclamation, unproblematic proclamation of the faith. On the other end is dialogue, both dialogue with the external culture and intra-dialogue with the church, within the church community itself. Around those two axes, you get 4 quadrants. Each of those quadrants then represents a different type of parish. And these parishes are theoretical, but I've also tested them through empirical surveys and discover that they are recognisable, that they are, people see them actually active in their parishes, and to some extent, they want one or the other of them in the future. I'll just say something briefly about each one. So in the top left-hand corner is what I've called the convinced parish. It sits in the quadrant of proclamation that's unproblematic and in the public arena. Now, just to say, of course, these are models, so none of them exist completely in reality. The idea of modelling is to throw light on the whole and see if there's anything we can learn. The convinced parish, unproblematic and uncritical proclamation in the public realm. This parish represents the hope that the Catholic parish will be actively promoting the Catholic faith for all, both inside and outside the church. The desire of that parish is to make the Catholic expression of the Christian faith more explicit and stronger by means of active proclamation. The conversion of all to Catholicism. All the teachings of the church are well known and followed. Moral teachings of the church, they're not optional, but they're mandatory. I've developed some little scenarios and stories, which we don't have time for today, that people who in this parish will often have a high and strong following of the moral teachings of the church, particularly around life issues, beginning and end of life, and so forth. Diagonally opposite the convinced parish, in the private realm, down the dialogue end of the scale, is what I've called the consumerist parish. The consumerist parish is diagonally opposed to the convinced parish. This is the parish trying to seek relevance by providing religious services for a variety of personal, religious, and spiritual needs. This parish, religious desires and spirituality are not challenged in any way. They're affirmed. Dialogue consists of talking about what I believe and want for my own spiritual life and for my own family and my own children. The parish responds positively and immediately to requests for religious and spiritual support for services with demands placed on parishioners. It's inclusive of all. The parish remains in the private realm, responding individually to family requests as they come up. There's lots of examples of the consumerist parish, and it's recognisable and desired by some. I won't give any particular examples yet because I want to move on. Again, on the left-hand side of the page, in the proclamation side of the scale, down in the private realm, is what I've called the devoted parish. And that's probably the baseline parish of the past, if you like. I think it was the parish that I grew up in as a child. We all knew our place. We all knew what to do. We were involved in the liturgy and the ritual. It was predictable. It provided comfort. We knew where we were. We knew there was a world outside of our parish, but we weren't particularly looking to engage with that. This is where we found our religious expression and life, in the devoted parish. And then on the right-hand side of the page, with the in the public side of the public-private axis and the dialogue side of the proclamation dialogue, is what I've called the engaged parish. And this is the parish searching for identity and engagement within this pluralizing, secularizing environment. The parish actively engages in dialogue in a public way in order to strengthen the faith, its own faith, and the faith of its parishioners. It's humble in its claims for truth and certainty. Its approach to the scriptures and to the dogmatic tradition are done in a hermeneutical way. That is a way that's communicative, exploring, interpreting. Catholicism is the interpretive key to understanding our faith, but open to reflection, critique, and ongoing development. So they're the four types of parishes: the convinced parish, the engaged parish, the devoted parish, the consumerist parish. None of them exist 100% on their own. There's probably bits in each parish and each of us. They throw light on the whole. Perhaps you're thinking of your own parish and recognising some of this yourself. Of course, there's the summary of those parishes: the convinced, actively promoting Catholic faith for all, both inside and outside the parish. The engaged parish, searching to be a parish through religiously inspired engagement in a pluralist environment. The consumerist parish, or the service parish, as they like to call it in Belgium, which is the other country that I've worked in and done research in, and in which this model is being used. Seeking relevance by providing religious services for a variety of personal and religious and spiritual needs. The devoted, seeking to remain Catholic by endorsing the cultic and devotional practices of the Church, together with other parishioners. Okay, of course, one of my questions was, how can we evaluate this? And so I've had to make some kind of theological call on where I think the normative position should be for the future. And maybe it's not a surprise, but there it is in the engaged parish quadrant. Why? Theologically, in the public and dialogical sphere, because God's self is a trinity of love and dialogue. Because our faith tells us, our belief is that each person is made in the image and likeness of God, capable of discovering and disclosing that God in whose image and likeness we are made. So for theological reasons, I have put the theological normative of the parish as the engaged parish. Okay, I won't talk more about, I've gone through those types. Each parish is characterised differently. I have developed over 22 different characteristics for each of those parishes. If you can see that slide now, I'm not going to go through them all because I want to move to just a couple. But the basic psychological value is different in each of those parishes. For the convinced parish, those who want to have the convinced parish now and in the future, the psychological value is certainty. Within the pluralist environment and the secularized environment, this parish is after certainty. The engaged parish is looking for challenge, both self-challenge and challenging those beyond themselves. The consumerist parish, the basic psychological there is value, is choice. And for the devoted parish, it's comfort. Leave us alone. The experience of time, number 2, is different. The convinced parish has an urgency about making sure that this certainty that it has is proclaimed out into the community. The engaged parish, with its psychological value of reflexivity, of challenge, is reflexive, reflecting on again and again. The consumerist parish experience of time is immediacy. We want this now. And the devoted parish is continuity. There are priests and there are faithful baptized, each who would like one or the other of these parishes. Some of them see them in their current practice, some of them desire them in their future. If we have time, I can show you some survey results about who's looking for what. But to the point of tonight, you can see I've developed again and again these parish characteristics for each of these types. And I've written about that, as Patricia said, in the gauging the hopes of parishes. For tonight's webinar, I thought that we should look at those 4 parishes in relation to synodality, because each of them has a different take and a different expectation of synodality. And this section I've worked on with my colleague from Catholic University of Leuven, Didier Polifet, with whom I've worked for many years on Catholic school identity in our EXI project, and on the searching for parish engagement scale that I've just taken you through. And in terms of the different types of parishes, we have different types of synodality at work, or theoretically and possibly actually different types of synodality at work. For the convinced parish, with its hope that everyone comes into the Catholic Church, we've defined this as a kerygmatic synodality. The kerygma, the preaching of the initial preaching of the church, and synodality takes on that form. I'm going to go into a bit more depth about that. For the engaged parish, we have what we've called a recontextualizing synodality. That is trying to talk about and reprofile the Catholic Church in the context of the pluralizing and secularizing culture around it. For the consumerist parish, we talk about active pluralizing, and I'll say what I mean by that in a moment. And the devoted parish is what we're calling a formal tolerant synodality. We'll tolerate it, but we're not that much in favour of it. Okay, let's have a look at what they look like. Professor Didier Polifet, my colleague, has called this the compass of the 4 subtypes of synodality. And they rub up against the SPES scale that I've presented to you in terms of the role of the long apostolic tradition in the church on the one hand, and the sensus fidelum, which is so important and crucial to synodality, that all the faithful have a sense of the truth of the tradition. Okay, here we go. Let's have a look at how these play out. So remember, I just spoke about the kerygmatic subtype of synodality, which fits nicely with the convinced parish that everyone should come into this parish. And there are groups of lay Catholics and priests who strongly believe in this type of future for parishes and for the church. Let's have we'll come back, let's have a look. This kerygmatic subtype. Well, the kerygmatic subtype understands and practices a synodality centred on fidelity to the apostolic tradition. It's oriented to a bold proclamation of the gospel. That's what we need to be doing, aimed at ultimately calling all the faithful to know Christ as proclaimed, authoritatively through the magisterium and the ecumenical councils. And in service to the gospel, this type prioritises commitment to Catholic tradition over engaging with diversity. Yeah. So the consultations that this type of synodality might have, both in a parish and in a diocese, are more to look for effective avenues for new methods of evangelisation, to promote orthodoxy and orthopractice and fidelity to the magisterium. Resistance to those calling for pastoral and theological dialogue with lived experience and challenging established teachings on controversial issues like sexual ethics and so forth, viewing this dialogue as a risk to the established gospel truth. Yeah? So this is one subtype of synodality that we've theorised about, but of course it fits neatly in with the convinced parish that is not just a theory, there's actual there's an actual desire among some parishes, baptised faithful and priests for that type of parish. Okay. Opposite the kerygmatic subtype of synodality is what we've called the active pluralising subtype. So as the culture pluralises and the church pluralises, this fits very nicely with the consumerist or the service parish model type. So the active pluralising subtype understands and practices synodality focus on this very decentralised participation. Listen and patient dialogue towards consensus building among the very diverse viewpoints in the church, emphasising the value of diversity and grounded in a sense of the fundamental equality that flows from baptism. This active pluralism type can horizontalise collaboration, if you like. And it's the opposite of the kerygmatic subtype, which emphasises so strongly the apostolic tradition. This subtype prioritises engaging in a multilateral way with diversity over its preference for any privileged authority to the apostolic tradition. Yeah? It can lead to the expression of lobbying for increased democratisation of the church, transparency, accountability, collaboration with ecumenical and interfaith partners on social issues, and at times downplaying Catholic theological distinctiveness in any of these efforts. There's calls in this active pluralising type to update Catholic moral teaching on social matters, such as contraception, homosexuality, divorce, bringing such teaching into closer dialogue with modern individual conscience. Yeah? So remember, none of these exist completely in isolation. These are models that are throwing light on how is synodality at work and what are the where are the trends and where are the indicators in parishes, in dioceses, where are the hopes for this type of synodality. It seems to me the kerygmatic subtype and the active plural are a bit at war with each other. They're diagonally opposite, just like the convinced parish is with the consumerist parish. They don't like each other. Then we have the third subtype, which is the formal tolerant subtype, which sort of fits with the devoted parish. wanting comfort, security, institutional way of living that's predictable. And the formal tolerant subtype of synodality understands and practices synodality focused on structural collaboration. Yes, transparent governance and participation in decision-making through representative mechanisms aimed at making the church and the parish more efficient, well-functioning, tolerant of pluralism. But it can sometimes come out as restructuring parishes into efficient mergers overseen by parish management teams with CEO-type pastors who can continue to roll out the teachings of the church. Bishops rely heavily on consultative diocesan council for their administrative policies, but not on doctoral or pastoral discernment. Networks of Catholic professional advancing managerial best practice for running churches and businesses. So you can see it's a formal, there's a tolerated way of synodality, but it's at a limited level that doesn't challenge any of the status quo. And finally, the recontextualizing type of synodality, which is fits in with my engaged parish, seeking to be a parish that's in dialogue internally and externally in order to strengthen the faith of individual members and the identity of the parish itself. This has a maximal understanding of the apostolic tradition and a maximum understanding of the role of the sensus fidalum. They need to come together. And the recontextualizing subtype understands and practices a synodality focused on the space, moment, and the process of communal discernment towards creative re-expressions of this ancient, millennium-rooted faith tradition, but in a new culture and a new social context. And it's only achieved through co-responsible listening to the Holy Spirit. The wisdom of the episcopate, the clergy, and the sensus fidalum, resulting in not already predetermined, but after the event, in the development of mutually informed doctrine and pastoral practice that has what Pope Benedict called a hermeneutic of continuity with the past, the recontextualizing subtype of synodality. Okay. Efforts to engage insights in this type of synodality from the human sciences like psychology and sociology, to develop new pastoral approaches on issues like we've heard a lot about since the Synod on Synodality, divorce and remarriage participation in the church. Theological debates weighing into developments like women deacons, blessing of same-sex unions, seen as potential new applications of pastoral ministry. There's a constructive dialogue between bishops and lay reform groups together, advocating for decentralisation and women's leadership in the church, for example. This recontextualising orientation has its impetus in Pope Francis, who really was the one who, in a sense, you could say almost his greatest legacy to the church of his gift of synodality. Whenever we make the effort to return to the source and to recover the original freshness of the gospel, new avenues arise, new paths of creativity open up, with different forms of expression, more eloquent signs and words, with new meaning for today's world. Every form of authentic evangelization is always new. So that's the impetus for the recontextualizing synodality. Synodality and SPES. SPES is the Searching for Parish Engagement Scale, which I outlined the 4 types of parishes, and then delved deeper into what does synodality look like in each one of those parishes. In my ministry as a parish priest, alongside my parish council, we are faced with the reality of all this mix within our parishes. And every diocese is faced with all this mix in its diocese. And the global church is faced with all this mix in its midst. I think the way ahead is to strive ahead to create these opportunities, big and small, for this recontextualising synodality opportunities of leaders, bishops, priests, and faithful all coming together. It's difficult, it's problematic, but it seems to me it is the only way forward, both theologically and culturally for the future. I might leave it there, Patricia, unless there's a desire to share some of the research results. What I can tell you is that as I survey parishes, I disaggregate the groups down into the priests and the leadership and their understandings of the parish, and in the future it will be their understanding of synodality, those who are active parishioners and those who are parishioners that aren't involved in any way. And each of those three groups have a different understanding and a different hope of what the church should be and probably of what synodality should be. But I might leave it there so we have time to discuss and reflect.
Thank you so much, Brendan. I think I'm going to have to watch the recording to take it all in. Someone has asked if the slides will be the slides that you shared will be available after the webinar. I'm not sure about the answer to that. Someone might let me know. We do have some questions specifically on what you've just been talking about. These parish types do not seem to us to reflect our experience of living in different parishes. In our experience, parishes reflect the approach of the priest, the predominant culture of those in attendance, etc. How do these types take us forward on the synodal path? Brendan, would you like to address that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. There is no doubt that the priest has a big impact on the shape of the parish. It's not the only shaping of the parish. The desires for either convinced or of devotional are quite strong. And they can be quite strong in communities of people who have a very strong ownership of their parish. So, yes, I wouldn't deny that the priest has a crucial and critical role to play, but I don't think we can underestimate the fact that the sensus fidelis also can provide a dynamic for the way that the parish is experienced as well. How are they going to help us with synodality? Because what we need to do among those parishes, among those parish types, if we're going to move forward, is, as hard as it is, talk to one another, because there are often many standoffs among those groups, particularly those who are dialogically opposed, like the devoted and the engaged, the consumerist, and the convinced. So there's a brief answer, Patricia.
Thank you. I have a message here that if Joe and Brendan are happy to share the slides with David from Garratt, they'll be able to circulate to the webinar registrants.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. There was another question there. Brendan, will this information be published in any way in the future?
The answer is yes. I have published a little bit about the parish types. I will look to do a shorter, more accessible publication of that. And I know that Didier is in the process of publishing the synodality subtypes.
Right. I have another question here. If parishes are so different, how could an effective synodal process be set up? Who would like to, would you both like to have a shot at answering that one? That's a really hard one, isn't it?
It is hard. I can only talk about my own approach, I guess. In parishes that I have been in, I have always worked with a parish council. I have, as a key synodal body, we've always ensured that we have working guidelines or constitution to that council, so that there is regular turnover of membership of the council. And we've always tried to develop some kind of strategy plan that could be shared with parishioners, and that there can be opportunity for input and shaping. But it's not easy to do that and to manage that. And not all of us have the skill set to manage what's necessary for that to happen. There's a lot of learning we all have to do about that.
Can I make a comment?
Yes,
Brendan, I absolutely agree with what you've said. And my experience of managing parishes in New Zealand, several together, and one of them was the cathedral, which was even more complex because the cathedral parish is different in its form and function to local parish churches. The complexity around it is managing change in a world without the theological, often sometimes the legal structures that enable you to do that. So, for instance, very simply, to appoint somebody as the lay pastoral leader of a parish and giving them then the permission that they need to preach, the permission that they need to bury and to marry, etc. All of that sort of stuff becomes part often of the problem, or it's another problem to solve in order to allow this person to do their job. So I agree with you. I think there was also very much aware for me, this is 25 years ago, that in the Archdiocese of Cologne, as they were facing all of these issues, and Cardinal Meissner was there, they introduced a whole structure which was beautifully worked out on paper, quite Germanic, of course. They'd figured out how many parishes they'd have over the next 30 years, how many priests they had, and then they appointed certain priests as the managing parish priest of many different small parishes. But in the end, the whole thing fell over because some of those men fell over because, literally and figuratively, because they became ill, they were overworked, and they just said, I didn't join the priesthood to become the manager of multiple parishes. But I think the reality is when you look at the history of the parish as it's evolved out of the Tridentine world, there were two types of parish here in Europe. There was the peasants' parish, which was for the country, and the priest was there, often married, and he did his job within a very small area. 3 kilometers away, there was another guy. When you come to the cities, you find multiple parishes all pushed up against one another, but the clergy there are much more located in the diocese, in the management and the structure. And so I think as we go forward, we have to take a fundamental look at the structure and nature of dioceses and to ask ourselves in some way, is the parish priest, like you, Brendan, of multiple parishes, in fact the bishop, who should have all of the liturgical and legal rights to manage that group, and the bishop is elected from the parish priests for a period of time in order to ensure the management of all of that and that they are all in unity. It would be a different model and it won't be accepted.
Thank you. I'm looking at 30 questions in front of me. We are obviously not going to be able to answer them all. We'll see how we go with a few more. What can the laity do to help or better help priests and bishops to embrace synodality, hopefully with some enthusiasm? You could both have a shot at that question. What can the laity do to help you?
Collaborate, I guess. I mean, that sounds, you know, obvious, I guess. It's interesting, you know, I can just reflect on my own experience at the moment, having been in the parish I'm in now just for over 1 year, and g'day to all those parishioners from Brunswick Moreland who are joining us tonight. But we are just going through a process of a strategic plan and calling for participation in various areas of parish life, steering committees and so forth. And it's always a challenge to get collaborators to work together. So I think take the opportunities when they come, I would say, and to my brother priests who are on the webinar tonight, I would say embrace the gifts and the collaboration that comes forward.
And Joe?
I think one of the key things is not to patronize the priest in the sense that he's part of the problem. And I think there's still a real difficulty in terms of a hierarchical understanding of priest. And this is where I think these two worldviews come into play. One is in the European Enlightenment view, generally speaking, the priest is seen fairly much as the problem to be solved. So I'm not sure the person asked in this way, but if you're saying, how can I help you, Father, to get out of the road? That would be one thing. Or how can I help you understand what the church is? Or how can I help you become part of the baptized? That would be one point of view. But I think the other point of view in the sacral world is that it's much more a differential approach of, Father, how can I help you? And that might be, can I open the doors of the church or turn on the lights? Or can I somehow sit at your feet and understand you? And again, these are huge generalizations. So I think the complexity around the answer is dependent on the context of the question and the person who's asking it.
Thank you. Maybe just a very quick, I'll ask one more question because it's quite similar to the last one. And then if you can answer very briefly, each of you, what would help the conversion process for priests who are fearful about losing their power and status in a synodal process?
Yeah, because I think that's a real question. So that some people would say too that clergy, especially diocesan clergy, don't want to get engaged because they know that it's a loss of power, and that they end up being even more, or feeling themselves sometimes to be more irrelevant. And I guess at that depth level, there are questions that, if that's true, then there are other ways that it needs to be approached. I think part of the process is to give clergy or enable clergy to have the security to know that their ministry and their purpose in the church is of value. That's what I would
Thank you.
answer.
Brendan, do you want to have a quick answer to that one?
Yeah, just look quickly. Look, it's of course the temptation, the human temptation in any leadership is abusive leadership in any organisation, in anyone in leadership. There's always the temptation to overstep. I guess I talk and work with a lot of priests whose biggest concern is the real worry about the bleeding of numbers and people walking away and not knowing what to do about it, and sometimes thinking the answer is to be to give more of a dogmatic response and so forth. I would say, if I could go back on the recontextualizing synodality, that acknowledges that we do have a long millennial tradition in the church with many good things to take from the past to offer, and it's okay, everyone. It's okay, my Lord. It's okay, Father. We're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're honouring the tradition, but there's some other things we need to talk about here. Can we do this together? I think.
Thank you, Brendan, and thank you everyone for all your questions. And I'm sorry that if we haven't been able to answer them all, we haven't been able to answer them all. We do like to finish on time. I would now like to invite Sister Carmel Pilcher to make a response to everything that we have heard on this webinar tonight. Good luck, Carmel.
Thank you, Patricia. Yes, I have pages and pages here. I will try to just keep within my time limit and just make a few comments. First of all, thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Joe. If we want to look at two models of priesthood, of ordained priesthood, we have them here with us tonight. And I think that each of them shows an incredible passion for their ministry. And I think this is important for us to acknowledge. More about that in a moment. I think I've, in the last 10 years, had the blessing and the difficulty of living in two totally different worldviews, moving between Australia and Fiji. And for the 2 years of COVID, I actually lived in Fiji. I just would like to make one point about that. And that is, when I get off the plane in Nandi, I suddenly have to shift the way I think. I have to let go of my Western way and try and be sympathetic and empathetic to the Fijian way. And when I look at a priest in front of me who might be presiding at Eucharist, I think you've had to do that too, and you have to continue to do that. So I think while it's a struggle and it's difficult, I think I'd just like to thank all of you young priests who have come to do mission work with us. And I also think that need we have to share with each other is really important. And the second point I'd just like to say, as I talked to the panel earlier, really, synodality is not Francis's invention. Synodality comes from Vatican II, and Francis was the first to say that. Leo is picking this up. Why are we surprised? Because, in fact, it comes straight out of Vatican II. And I'm old enough as a young religious in the 70s to know that I worked in parishes and schools that were completely synodal. We didn't have the language, but we did work across with our young priests, with our, in my case, Maris brothers were there as well, and our amazing parish priest. We shared with the new people who were in the parish who were Italians. We tried to get to understand them, with the people who were Australian. So I think back in the 70s, when we were grappling with the council, and it was also exciting, we actually had started this synodality. We didn't have the Ignatian way, but we did have, many of us, the Cardine way, the See, Judge, Act methodology. So I think to put that into the context is important as well. Now, just to say a couple of things, Joe, I wasn't surprised by your challenging and highly substantiated comments. They're not comments that Joe just pulls out of the air. They come out of his own person, his own study, and where you talk about the fact that we now live in a church that is non-theological, that's a big concern that I have. We have people in really significant ministries, especially in dioceses, who don't have the theological understanding because they haven't had the opportunity, possibly. And I think this is an important point to make. Priests do have a long time in a seminary. Priests also, many priests, especially you two, but you stand for many others who continue studying, continue reflecting, continue to grow your spirituality so that you are our leaders. And this does become something very important for us. We don't offer the appropriate training, you say, Joe. Absolutely. And I think while this has been an issue, and I think the bishops really must take a stand now, and I know their money has been swallowed up in, our money has been swallowed up in other issues. We need to revisit this whole need for us to have not only our priests formed, but our laity formed as well. So then we can stand as equals who are able to share with each other. The word that jumped out at me, Joe, was trust. When you talked about trust, I think this is one of the key issues of synodality. Can we begin not by looking at the differences, but by looking at what we have in common? And I think this becomes a really important aspect of our conversation. I'm not giving you justice to what you've been sharing, but it's been a very powerful, and I thank you for that, Joe. Brendan, I really don't know you very well, but I'm starting to make some connections now. I just found your ability to analyse, your analytical way, and this amazing way that you have broken down the possibility of parish communities, very powerful. Mind you, your job description for a priest, I don't think would be very good for vocations, really. We're looking at all the aspects that priests are expected to cover, and they are expected to cover. So I think that has to be looked at. We've got to really work on this. You talked about the growing pluralism, which of course we know in this postmodern church that we belong to. And now, Joe, you could tell me it's something else beyond that. But what Gerard Kelly said a couple of years ago to me at our Parramatta Synod that really struck home to me was when we talk about our young priests, they're looking for certainty. And we have grown up and lived with perhaps a lot more plurality, and you've shown that, Brendan, in your and analysing the models of parish. But how does a young man walk into one of those scenarios when he is looking for something that's certain and he has already made his decision about what that might look like, possibly even before he goes to the seminary? So all of this adds up to the huge complexity that we're talking about. And I did have a thought, Brendan, when a parish has a certain model, how on earth does a priest move from another model into that when he gets transferred? And this has been a big, because my other diocese was Adelaide, where I lived for some decades. we had priests who were doing amazing synodal work, and then they got moved, and somebody got moved in who had a very different understanding of church, and the people had to kind of deal with a new way where there wasn't a lot of consultation that had gone on before that. So just to conclude, there's so much I could pick up, but I think somebody in the chat talked about that we all share in Christ's priesthood, and I think we need to go there. I think it's time for us not just to talk about ministerial priests in one box and priestly people through the baptized in another box. That's actually pre-Vatican II thinking. Vatican II invited us to see ourselves as all sharing in Christ's priesthood. And so, unfortunately, the language puts the ministerial priest as the only priest, but in fact, all the documents of Vatican II out of the Catechism talk about one priest and all of us sharing in that priesthood. So I think it's really important that that becomes our focus. And I'd be really interested as a theologian, a sacramental theologian, to look at next year maybe to see how all of this, how Eucharist connects with all of this. So just finally, are we hopeful about the church in Australia? As somebody asked, absolutely. I belong to a congregation, the Josephites. We've just finished our chapter. We've come up with a half a page. I wasn't a delegate, but we've come up with a half a page of our vision for our future. You would not if you read that vision, you would not recognise the fact that our average age is 81, probably higher now, that our sisters are continuing, however, within that to see hope, and we're also looking at how we can minister into the future. So I think, yes, there is great hope for our church in Australia, and I think these two priests have just shown us what that hope might look like. So thank you.
Thank you, Carmel. And thank you once again to all our speakers tonight, and to the Australasian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform and Garratt Publishing for making webinars such as these possible. We hope that you've enjoyed participating and that you leave with some new understanding and insights that will lead to positive action in your own local context. Our next webinar will be Thursday, the 5th of February, and it will be Dr. Orm Rush talking about the continuing relevance of Vatican II. We hope you'll be able to join us. Goodbye and good night.